Today, we're going to talk about some of the most terrifying places in the US. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Situated in New Orleans is a cemetery known as the St. Louis Cemetery. The St. Louis Cemetery is actually home to a few really interesting people. And although it is one of the oldest cemeteries in New Orleans, you can actually still visit it today. It's also considered one of the most haunted cemeteries in the United States. In just one block, the burial grounds hold over 700 tombs. And inside the actual cemetery, there's over 100,000 bodies. And that list is still growing because it is an active gravesite still. And for over 200 years, there's been rumors of people having run in with some ghosts. The St. Louis Cemetery is very eerie, even in the daylight. It's home to 100,000 corpses, some who actually have quite an interesting history. And you can see from looking at it that there's like broken cobblestones and there's a lot of decay and crumbling crypts. And what's even more fascinating about this cemetery, not only is it disorderly and the layout kind of doesn't make sense, but all of the bodies that have been placed in this cemetery aren't actually buried in the ground. So the city's high water table makes it impossible to actually bury bodies into the ground. That means that these crypts are really the only way to bury people. And if you were to say bury somebody in the ground, the coffin would simply just float back up to the surface. So really these crypts account for the reason that the cemetery kind of feels a bit chaotic because it's not neat and clean and orderly. There's tons of crypts and obviously above ground, different sizes and located in all sorts of areas. And if you want to be buried in this gravesite, it is not going to be cheap. The going price for a plot is around $40,000. And you might be wondering why a plot in a cemetery could be $40,000. But when we consider who you'll be spending eternity next to, it gets quite a bit more interesting. And one of these famous people happened to be Marie Laveau, who is commonly known as the Voodoo Queen. Marie was born in 1801 and would eventually become one of the most respected and quite a bit feared voodoo practitioners in New Orleans history. She practiced fortune telling, she worked with the occult, and worked with herbal remedies. She was also a renowned midwife. Of course, there isn't much we can substantiate about Marie's life. Some of these things include whether or not she had a snake named Zombie, or that she practiced with the occult and things like that. Things we do know, though, are she was a well-known female religious leader and community activist. She would visit prisons and she'd provide lessons to women in the community and, of course, doing rituals for those in need. And what's even more fascinating about Marie, she was a hairdresser to the wealthy. And some say she used her career as a hairdresser to develop this network of informants, mostly servants in these rich white households. And she really excelled in getting information on these people. Some say she did this by instilling fear in the servants, who she either paid to get this information or cured mysterious illnesses for them. So really, she had this quite advanced network and this system. And of course, as awareness grew about her skills and all of this, so her power and her fame grew, and really, she became quite untouchable. And really, legend has it that she knew the secrets about all levels of society. And this is actually quite believable, not only because hordes of people fawned over her and she was well respected, but because she had this beauty parlor and had a network of people working for her. So it wouldn't be surprising that she knew quite a bit of information about those in power. She really was the go-to voodoo practitioner in the 19th century. And of course, her ghost has been spotted in many locations throughout the French Quarter. Many say that they see her just walking slowly past her house at 1022 St. Anne Street. She would be most recognized by her red and white turban tucked around her hair and by the brilliant colored clothes she wore. But even as people followed her, she would just disappear and vanish right from sight. And those who dare to venture into the cemetery have claimed to see her walking through the tombs. And those who have degraded Marie or her beliefs or a religion have experienced some pretty instant karma. There's reports of people being bitten and scratched and shoved down to the ground. And as they say, Marie wasn't always deemed the friendliest of spirits in the cemetery. But that doesn't stop people from going to visit her tomb. In fact, people seek it out for an interesting reason. So when you go to Marie's tomb, you're going to see a bunch of X's, and usually they're in a line of 3. And people mark 3 X's on her tomb before they ask her for a favor or a wish. And if this wish or favor is granted, that person is required to come back to her tomb and leave a gift at the site of her tomb. But unfortunately, this led to a lot of vandalism, so they had to actually close down the cemetery to the public. You can still visit this haunted cemetery, but you need a licensed tour guide. And although they have this new policy, it hasn't stopped people from sneaking into the cemetery at night, hoping to get a glimpse of Marie, or of course asking her for a wish or a favor. And really, visitors, even the ones that shouldn't be there, report that when they're next to her tomb, people have feelings of being touched, or they become reportedly ill out of nowhere, and they have said to hear voices coming from inside the tomb. With all this being said, although it's vastly interesting, and of course everybody loves a good ghost story, it's really important to preserve history. So don't go vandalize and don't break into this cemetery. So if you want to visit her tomb, you can get a licensed tour guide and go. But beware and be prepared for whatever lies waiting for you when you get there. And remember, Marie was one of the most powerful voodoo queens. Do you really want to upset her even from the grave? Next on our list of the most terrifying places in the US is the Ohio State Reformatory. This reformatory is supposedly known for being home to some of the most violent ghosts. This includes spirits of inmates rioting, inmates fighting themselves to death, overcrowding, and not only are the cells haunted by former prisoners, so are the halls. So the Ohio State Reformatory began in 1862. The field that the reformatory would eventually be built on was actually home to a training camp for Civil War soldiers. Eventually, the city raised about $10,000 to purchase 30 acres of land for the prison, and the state would go on to acquire 150 acres. And this prison was supposed to be a halfway point between the Boys Industrial School in Lancaster and the state penitentiary in Columbus. Construction began in 1886, and the prison remained under construction until 1910. There was a lot of construction delays and funding issues. The goal of the prison was to design it in a way that would encourage and help inmates be reborn into their spiritual selves, thus healing them. In 1896, the reformatory opened its doors and accepted 150 prisoners. These inmates were brought by train from Columbus, and they were put to work on the prison sewer system and constructing a 25-foot stone wall that wrapped around the prison. And over time, this reformatory officially kind of transitioned into a high-security prison. And with that transition, some of the most violent offenders were placed in the prison. And many of you might actually know this prison from a famous movie known as The Shawshank Redemption. So the original goal of this was to reform and rehabilitate the prisoners, and it was actually met with success. So they received 3 different things when they were brought to the reformatory: religion, education, and a trade. Inmates were admitted for about 18 months, and if they showed progress in those 3 sections and just overall, they could be released. If not, they'd be there for another 18 months. And really, they had a high success rate with this program, and that would soon change by the 1960s. The state pulled its financial support for Ohio State Reformatory. And with that, they also got rid of the reform model, those 3 things: religion, education, and trade. And after they removed all of the funding and they got rid of this model that was really having a good success rate, they turned into a high security prison. And the conditions of the prison became incredibly terrible for the inmates. So prisoners began to die from various things: influenza, some died of natural causes, but many unfortunately died to the violence that was encaged in those prison walls. Some inmates hung themselves. There's record of one inmate actually setting himself on fire. There was 2 men put in a really small tomb-like cell, and when they were finally let out, only one of them made it out. He left his roommate's body stuffed underneath a bunk. And deep beneath the prison ground was a place similar to what we now know as solitary confinement. And down there was total isolation from everyone else. And I can only imagine how terrible and how miserable that was. Alone in the dark, disgusting basement, all by yourself in a small area. And not only did some of the prisoners suffer, but some of the workers would eventually suffer. In July of 1948, the reformatory's farm boss, his wife, and daughter were kidnapped and shot to death by 2 parolees that were hell-bent on revenge. Robert Daniels and his partner, James West, murdered this family, and then a 6-statewide manhunt went underway. And this actually ended with a shootout that left James West dead. And Daniels told the police as he signed his confession, "I'll get the chair." And then in 1950, disaster would strike again. In the warden's living quarters, the warden's wife was removing a jewelry box from a closet shelf and somehow in the process dislodged a pistol from its hiding place. When it hit the floor, the gun went off and inflicted a fatal wound. But that wasn't the end of the bad luck. The warden, working alone in his office nearly a decade later, had a a fatal heart attack. So obviously this prison has been home to a lot of death. And you can see from pictures, these cells were not meant to house the vast amount of prisoners that it did. And many of these cells were single man cells that held 3 inmates. So you can only imagine being in a very, very tiny, cramped, claustrophobic space with 3 other people. And being in such a confined space with 3 other people obviously is going to breed some sort of violence eventually. And of course, with the rise of violence, discipline also was on the rise. This started with things like solitary confinement, extra long work hours, cutting down social time, and even reducing the amount of food an inmate could have. And when these discipline approaches weren't working, guards took it in their own hands. And what they did was enact torture on these inmates. They would commit torturous acts like electrocution or waterboarding. They made something known as a hot box, which later became known as the hole. And this was a really, really small space where prisoners were placed. And it was very hot, hotter than a sauna. And they were just left down there. And because of this increased violence, not only with the inmates who were obviously acting out against a terrible system, but the guards enacting violence on inmates, the situation became dire. The food was disgusting and inedible. There was rats that were spreading disease. And obviously there was an increased amount of fights among the inmates. And oftentimes the guards wouldn't get in the middle of these fights to break them up because they knew it could result in their own death. And in the 1930s, a large-scale riot broke out in the eastern cell block of the prison. And the guards, after they regained control of the prison, would punish the inmates by doing something completely torturous. They sentenced nearly 120 of the inmates to these extremely dark and confined cells for over a week. But they didn't just put 1 inmate per cell. They put at least 10 inmates in 1 cell without food or water. And this led many of the prisoners into insanity. And some even met their death. And I mean, these were incredibly small spaces. And to put 10 people in there, you would physically probably always be touching one another in some sort of way. And nearly a decade later, one of the prison guards who had shut down the riot and, of course, dished out the punishment was stabbed to death with a homemade knife. And he died in a matter of hours from excessive bleeding. And of course, in the 1960s, the volume of inmates is increasing in a place that was never meant to hold them. And even inmates on death row were housed with 2 or 3 other people in their cell blocks. And because they were already sentenced to death and they knew their fate, many of these inmates would kill their cellmates before they ever made it to their death penalty sentence. In the 1990s, when all of these issues came to light, people were shocked by the inhumane treatment of these prisoners. And that led to the closure of the Ohio State Reformatory. A new jail was eventually established near the Reformatory, known as the Mansfield Correctional Institute, which would go on to house many of the inmates. And a lot of the buildings and walls and things like that were demolished until the Preservation Society stepped in and turned it into a museum. You can actually go visit the Ohio State Reformatory on a tour, but beware because many tour goers have claimed to hear and see inmates walking around, not only in their cells, but in the hallways. Some claim to hear footsteps and see shadowy figures. Sometimes you can hear chains dropping to the floor. And if you listen closely enough, you may just be lucky enough to hear the faint sound of church bells. And because of all the things that have happened in that building, I have no doubt that there is some energy still there. And last on our list is the Manteno State Hospital. In 1930, Manteno State Hospital opened its doors to deal with the overcrowding of other asylums. And people really were excited about this because it was going to bring jobs that they desperately needed due to the Great Depression. But as the population grew, the conditions of the state mental hospital only worsened. Abuse and neglect became rampant as budget cuts and World War II started to take resources and staff away from the hospital. A typhoid fever epidemic swept through the hospital and killed dozens and left hundreds infected. And even worse, government doctors began to experiment on the patients. And these experiments included things from electroshock therapy to lobotomies and even injecting patients with malaria. And hundreds of patients died due to these experiments. So in the 1930s, when this was being constructed, it really was meant to rehabilitate. And unlike many other asylums at the time that were contained to one building, the Manteno facility actually used cottage-like structures. So the facility was composed of several cottages villages, each named after a prominent psychologist. They even implemented an on-site farm, which was used to rehabilitate and help patients as a form of therapy. And it remained a small asylum for quite some time, but then it suddenly began to grow. And of course, people were thrilled about this because more jobs. But as I stated earlier, as the population grew, conditions began to deteriorate. And although the national health budget had been slashed, the asylum kept expanding. In 1937, they added a tuberculosis ward, bringing in hundreds more patients amidst this budget cut, and of course, staff shortages. In 1939, when the typhoid fever broke out, it killed among 60 people, but infected over 400. And then with World War II breaking out, doctors and staff were removed from the hospital and placed where they would be helpful for soldiers. Population inside the asylum was also growing. And by 1950, they had over 8,000 patients, becoming the fourth largest mental asylum in the nation. Obviously, it's wartime. There's a huge shortage of not only staff, but budgeting. So asylums did become a place of abuse and neglect. Patients often were left to fend for themselves. And because of this, they did attack their caretakers often. And escapes also became quite common. In 1941, there were 200 escape efforts alone. There was reports of sexual abuse, which enraged mental health advocates. And although all of the neglect and abuse was terrible, it really did not reign in comparison the experiments that doctors were inflicting on the patients. So the goal of these asylums was to cure and find a way to control mental illnesses. And one of the main ways they began doing this was through electroshock therapy. For those of you that don't know, electroshock therapy is literally as it sounds. You are sending shocks to the brain in an attempt to control the mental illness. And generally speaking, the practice did not work. A lot of the times, not only were the patients left extremely traumatized, but they even suffered brain damage or neurological disorders and even heart problems. And during World War II, these experiments became even more dark. Doctors would even inject malaria into patients in an attempt to cure the disease. And as all of this is going on, lobotomies became a well-known practice in these places. And for those of you that don't know what a lobotomy is, please be aware that it's a graphic thing that I'm going to explain to you, so viewer discretion is advised. And a lobotomy was literally the act of drilling a hole in the front of the skull in order to modify certain mental health behaviors. It involves severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, and doctors believe that this could cure things like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. In actuality, they were leaving their patients with extreme and severe brain damage. Those that could actually retain motor control were left emotionally in a blank state, and most who actually underwent these lobotomies would later die as a result from the complications of the surgery. And these were performed without the knowledge or the consent of patients, and some 400 patients died due to these experiments. And then by the 60s and 70s, Mancini consisted of elderly patients, alcoholics who voluntarily checked themselves in, and a lot of homeless people that may not have had documentation. They also took in patients that were considered too insane to go to prison, but too dangerous to be left on the streets. And then in 1983, state officials decided to finally close their doors, which in my opinion was a good idea. And much of the facility's grounds have been renovated for things like a golf course, industrial park, and a group home for at-risk youth. So through its 50 years of existence, the facility was full of people that were victims of abuse. And of course, that left quite a dark history and legacy over the buildings. Not only was there disease and torture and sometimes just outright murder, there was also brutal experiments done on patients without their consent and sometimes without their knowledge. And many were buried on a cemetery on the premises. And those who dare to go to the hospital have often reported seeing people roaming through the buildings. Others have heard voices calling out to them, and some may have even felt a cold hand touching them as they navigated through the dark and dreary halls. But some simply say they can just feel a strange presence when you enter, and that's quite enough for anyone. But that's it for today, guys. Thanks so much for joining me. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.